I'm here today to talk about big game and big science, African animals, and the really complicated history of modern museums. And when I say that, I'm really thinking about museums in the global north that are, in large part, representing people's histories, cultures, stuff from the global south. But I want to start by talking about why history matters. I'm faculty in the history department. I have a long affiliation and interest in global studies. I actually have a degree in international relations, but I'm a historian for particular reasons. So I wanted to start with why history matters. What can historical analysis reveal that other forms of inquiry don't tell us? And in my case, the questions I have about this particular project, asking historical questions reveals important blind spots in environmental studies and in ecology, in zoology and in botany, and in the critical studies of race and masculinity. History also reveals important differences between local and global interpretation. And those differences matter a lot to the story that I want to tell. Now, when I talk about history, I have two presumptions in mind. The first one is that history is an inquiry-based discipline. It's a practice of asking questions. It's not just a list of a bunch of dead people that you had to memorize to pass an AP test. I know that that is perhaps the way a lot of you have interacted with it. I see some familiar grins, right? But that's not what I do, and that's not what we think about doing with history at the college level. So it's inquiry-based, right? And it's an interpretive act. There isn't a set of facts that we just go and gather up and then produce and say, oh, here, look, I wrote a paper, it's history. It's about making sense of evidence from the past. So that's what I'm doing in this talk. In this talk, right, and in the research that I'm doing that backed this talk up, I'm working as a world historian. And that's another really particular and intentional move. And I'm doing that because neither African history, which is my specialty, nor the histories of empire and colonization, which is another field that I am very interested in, can fully capture the story or explain what was going on in this particular set of interactions that I'm talking about. Now, museums in Western Europe and in North America, and this is whether they're art museums, culture museums, science museums, they all share an intellectual heritage. And those museums, even the most well-respected and the ones whose labs continue to produce cutting-edge research, are not culturally or socially neutral. What does that mean? Right? The knowledge that they're producing about the natural world reflects really human preoccupations with race, with gender, with economic power, and with political prestige. So I've got this picture up here, right, of former US President Theodore Roosevelt and his rhinoceros trophy. Now, this animal was shot, intended to be a scientific specimen, while who was very recently ex-President Roosevelt, was on an expedition for the Smithsonian Institution, right, the premier national museum collection in the US. I argue that Teddy and his rhino have quite a story to tell. I want to start that story by asking you to consider the Blaubok. It's a familiar animal to anyone? Nope. It's a Blaubok. It's a mid-sized antelope, about 4 feet tall at its shoulders. It's got these backwards curving horns, and you can see that in the picture. Those are about 2 feet long. It's a pretty remarkable characteristic for an animal that's only 4 feet high, right? Imagine if you had half your height, again, flailing around on the top of your head. This large horn structure definitely places the Blaubok with its larger cousins, roan and sable antelopes. This particular animal, the Blaubok, was lithe, right? It was pretty thin, blue-gray. It was never as numerous as the springbok and the impala, which are ubiquitous animals for present-day safari goers. If you ever went to Southern Africa or Eastern Africa on an animal-looking trip, you'd see hundreds and hundreds of springbok and impala. There were never that many Blaubok running around. Today, you're not going to find an eagle-eyed tracker or a lucky tourist who'll spot one of these Blaubok. There's no African herd boy who's going to go home to his parents and report that he saw an unusual buck while he was taking the cattle out to their grazing area. Why is that? Because the Blauwalk has been extinct since 1800. This was the first large African mammal to succumb to the intensified fight for acres and resources that accompanied the spread of settler colonialism. So if you want to see a physical example of a Blauwalk and its extravagant horns, you can visit a taxidermied specimen. And where would you go do that? At museums in Stockholm, Vienna, Paris, or Leiden. Where are those cities? Europe. Where did this animal come from? Africa. So if you were African and interested in the history of your own place, you wanted to understand the physicality of an animal that's now extinct in your environment, could you do that at home? No, right? You've got to go to Europe to a museum collection to be able to see it. In Leiden, in the Netherlands, is where the species type specimen is currently on display. That's where it first was, and it's still there. Any science students in the room? So your friend nominates you, but you pull back. No. Does anybody know what a type specimen is? The most perfect specimen available. It's not always perfect, right? But it is the exemplar that defines biologically what the species is. And so if someone finds a new kind of fish or beetle and they think it's not exactly like other species and they're going to make it a new species, it's going to be compared against the type specimen. There's one type specimen for every species. It's someplace identifiable in the world, right? And that's how scientists, biologists work on naming, categorizing, and then making new species, because it's got to be different enough from the type specimen. Now, this guy, Robert Jacob Gordon, we'll hear more about him, who drew this particular drawing. He did not draw this from life. Right? He had to kill the animal so that it was still enough for him to be able to draw it. And this was another very common practice. It's still a practice if you look at bird books that are drawn. They're not drawn from somebody sitting under a tree trying to get a good look at a chickadee. No, they shot that chickadee out of the tree and put it, spread it all out so that they could draw it very well. All the traces of the Blauwalk have been erased from their original homes in the grasslands of southern Africa, while the scholarship about this animal resides beyond the purview of most African people. The direct evidence of this once living Blauwalk is in collections cataloged and housed in European museums, understood as components of biological knowledge that we presume to be universal. Right? Everybody had to take a biology class somewhere in high school, maybe in college, right? And we presume that this biology works the same way everywhere. Right? That's a characteristic of universal knowledge. Biology is based on empirical research and structured around repeatable experiments like other forms of science. And therefore, in our way of thinking, like the way that structures teaching and knowledge production at the University of California, that this knowledge is truth. I argue, and I'm not alone in arguing this, right, that there are other culturally and empirically, meaning testable, valid ways of understanding the natural world and humans' place in it. Right? That's how come I fit in a global studies conversation, because I want to take us to a more holistic understanding of humans and our place in the world. But we struggle in a Western knowledge, a model of Western knowledge production. We struggle to see these other ways as viable ways of knowing because of the ways that we've learned, the ways we have been taught since we started going to school. And we continue to have that way of learning reinforced by the world around us. We're in a college classroom that's reinforcing that way of knowing. If you go see any museum exhibition anywhere in the global north, it's going to reinforce this way of knowing too. So, let's go from history to the present. I'm taking us to New York City, to the American Museum of Natural History, and to the Akeley Hall of African Mammals, or African Animals. This is perhaps the most impressive and sizable collection of African animal specimens in the world. Where is it? the middle of Manhattan. Right? This is not the place we expect to go see the biggest collection of dead African animals. Many of the specimens that belong to the museum have been arrayed and arranged for educating the public at the AMNH, the museum. But how did these 7 elephants get to New York? They clearly didn't walk there, and they did not arrive alive. Why are they displayed and posed the way they are? So here's another little pitch for history. Everything has a history, right? You go into the museum, this isn't what you're supposed to be thinking about. You're supposed to be thinking about how cool the elephants are. But looking at this display, right, and you read, and I heard from Professor McCarty that perhaps you struggled with and responded to this Donna Haraway article about how museum exhibitions are created, right? This exhibition is telling us more stories than just the fact that elephants are big, that they go in herds, that there's small sexual differences between male and female examples of the species. So I want to take us through a couple of views of the Akeley Hall, right? And this slide gives us a sense. Here we've still got the elephants in the center. You can see about how the room is. There's all these dioramas. So they're windows into artificially reconstructed settings with taxidermied animals all around in a circle around the elephants. And then you can barely see here, there's a second floor. So there's a second gallery of these vitrines or diorama displays around the room, each giving us a different look into the world of African animals. Now, this specific form of edutainment, as I think about it, has been on display in New York City since the 1920s. We're coming up, in some cases, we've just passed the 100th year anniversary of the display of a remarkable collection of dead animals. The museum itself, the AMNH, attract over 5 million visitors a year. Right, so that's a lot of people going through. And this African room is one of the museum's gems. So a lot of those 5 million people are at least walking through this space. So they're absorbing, whether they're paying attention or not, some of the subliminal messages in the museum display. Now, the animals that are on display are a really small part of the 33 million specimens of animals that the museum owns. So it's huge. These taxidermied specimens interest me because they're part of an answer to a global question that's becoming ever more urgent in today's world. What's at the root of global inequality? Anybody have a good answer to that? No? Is that a?
Yeah, I would, limited resources.
Limited resources is part of what's at the root of global inequality.
Differences.
Differences? Say a little bit more, what kind of differences?
Like race, gender, genes, like your IQ, like all the differences would create.
Okay, so human differences, in essence, explain part of global inequality. I imagine that few of you, if posed this question, would end up thinking this, right? That part of what's at the root of global inequality is the display in New York City of elephants and gorillas and rhinoceros and a water hole with all kinds of species, right? But that's the argument I'm trying to make. And you can let me know in a few minutes whether I'm very successful at making it when we get to broader question and answer. So in this space, I don't want to review the scholarly answers because this question, what's at the root of global inequality, right? There's been a lot of academic ink as well as popular ink spilled on trying to explain that. And I want to rehash that except to say that understandably, most of those answers focus on economics or political economy, and that's understandable. But I am choosing to focus on another aspect of imperialism, the absorption and the adaptation of valuable information and then the subsequent devaluing of the sources of that information. How do, and I'll phrase this in fairly blunt terms, how do white people living in London or Paris presume to know anything about elephants or rhinoceros, particularly before the 20th century? Right? If they know anything, it's mediated through interactions with Africans that then don't show up directly in the historical record. And their participation got erased. And that has to do with the basic history of Western museums. Since the 18th century, cutting-edge research about the world's plants and animals has come from museums. Museums are sites of knowledge production, like universities are. As a result, many museums today are repositories of millions of specimens, right? I already talked about 33 million of them being in New York. For every species in the taxonomy we learned in high school, you want to remember this? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? For every one of those millions and millions of species, right, there's a type specimen. Whether we're talking about a blaubuck or a beetle, somewhere in a museum that type specimen lives. Scientists have identified 5,416 different kinds of mammals, 18,000 birds, right, and hundreds of thousands of insects. That's a lot of stuff to catalog, to take care of, and to store. Right? There's no Marie Kondo in the museum world. The stuff that museums have gets used. In its 2018 annual report, that's the most recent report for the AMNH, the museum proclaims 418 new scientific publications. I mean, that would take you more than a quarter to read all of those new papers, right, that the museum produced. 500 separate animal species were used in a single study on malaria at the museum in that year. Right, so this model of intellectual production tends to justify itself. We have all this stuff cataloged and collected in museums because then we use it to make new discoveries and understand. Therefore, museums need ever more specimens, right? And this specimen gathering has a very long history. And that's part of what I want to ask about. How did we get here? To a place where having and displaying animals in this fashion looks like a normal thing. So, a quick history of museums. This is going to be our timeline going across the screen here. Starts in the 15th century with curiosity cabinets. Just collections of stuff that learned men, right, and in this case they were all men, had to represent the natural world, the human world, local places, and faraway places. Learned men collected lots of stuff, natural history, ethnography, fanciful creations. Really big thing in curiosity cabinets in the 17th century were mermaids from Japan, right? So this is genuine scientists studying mermaids. We know there's no mermaids. There's really interesting history and documented evidence of the industry in mermaid creation in Japan for sale to European markets. They knew they were making fakes. They started with little monkeys, glommed them onto fish. Anybody been in the Western US and seen a taxidermied jackalope? Yeah? Yeah? No, it's a little jackrabbit with antelope horns, right? And it's funny, it's weird, and if you're in a small enough town in Montana, people will really try and tell you from the outside world, like, no, the jackalopes are real here, man. Look, we've got one. Like, once these things are dead, you can put them together. It's not that hard. So that's all the fun stuff that was in curiosity cabinets. In the 17th century, these cabinets took on royal trappings, right? Kings, princes, nobles, they wanted to have their own curiosity cabinets. Mostly they didn't do the work themselves. They hired smart people. Before there were many, many university posts, people like me had to go work for royalty, right? Let me just be your interesting assistant and I'll help you collect stuff and you can show off and I'll tell your friends when they come what great stuff you have. Right, so here are some examples of very important early royal collections in the Netherlands, in France, in London, and in the Holy Roman Empire, what becomes Austria. Now, it's not a coincidence that as we see this moment of transition to growing royal collections, this was in Europe. Right? In Europe, this is also the period of European imperial expansion. That these empires, or these kingdoms, are now becoming empires, and they've got territory in faraway places full of people and plants and animals that the Europeans don't know much about. So they're collecting and bringing all this stuff back and trying to make sense of these places and things that they now claim to rule. Now this process, I skipped a part, 18th century, high point of European imperialism. The big European states were all sponsoring major voyages of exploration and discovery with the underlying idea that they're going to bring back lots of specimens. Right? Captain Cook and his sailing around the world, showing up in Hawaii and getting killed, was perhaps one of the better known examples of this process. Right? But he was not alone. Bougainville, if you walk around campus, you walk around Orange County, the Bougainvillea plant, named for this guy, right? These subtle ways in which this imperial history shows up in our lives. I want to talk about Gordon, who will come up a little bit later in my talk. By the 19th century, this process of collecting had translated from royalty to a real interest in the public and a real interest in kind of exoticizing display. Right? Remember, this is a period there's no TV, there's no movies. What are people doing for popular entertainment? They're going to see public displays, they're going to museums, which are now becoming public spaces, largely on the transition of royal collections being made available to the general public. And they're doing things like going to circuses and seeing freak shows. Right? This is the era of Barnum and Bailey. In the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about three particular expeditions to help feed this growing desire for interesting public display in the United States. 1898, the Field Museum in Chicago, which is now at that point a new natural history museum, sends an expedition to Somaliland to start collecting specimens. In 1909, the Smithsonian sent an expedition to East Africa to collect all kinds of different specimens. Right? Both of these museums, the Field and the Smithsonian, are a little bit younger than the American Museum of Natural History, which had a head start, which already had some of these like groovy type specimens. So these newer museums are going, we got to get out there, we need to get in the field, we need to play a little bit of catch up so that we look serious too. And then finally, an expedition in 1921 run by the AMNH to collect gorilla in Congo. Right? This is the gorilla slide that I showed a few minutes ago. Those animals came from this 1921 gathering. Gorillas at that point, little side note, were really mysterious. People didn't know much about them. King Kong, right? The idea of a crazy gorilla gone rogue, right? That's a 1932 movie. So, I mean, that was still a plausible story a decade after this first expedition. Now note on this slide the kind of telescoping of time. Right here I've got centuries. Don't pay any attention to the space, that's just because I'm not a good graphic designer. But you can see here I'm talking about centuries, and as we get closer to our own time period, I'm starting to talk about particular dates and very particular events. The common denominator in these three expeditions by American institutions to go to Africa and try and collect specimens is a guy called Carl Akeley. If you read Donna Haraway, you've had a little bit of an introduction to Akeley already. Right? He's known as the father of modern taxidermy. He's a little bit of a Forrest Gump character in that he turns up at all these momentous moments in the late 19th and early 20th century. Sometimes he was a spectator, sometimes he was a participant, sometimes he was a driving force. It was pretty remarkable that this one guy was there at these various turning points. Akeley is also, in my reading, an uber patriarch. He's really focused on projecting a masculine identity. And in my interpretation, this is where a historian comes into play, this is what happens when you have an informally educated farm boy from upstate New York who winds up hobnobbing with the elite of New York City without ever shedding all of his insecurities about not having a formal education or not coming from a fancy family. It's also what happens when you're even more ill-educated, small-town, Midwestern, party girl wife turns out to be better at shooting elephants than you are. It's a big blow to someone's masculine ego. Carl Akeley was a dude who needed to be in charge and who needed to have all the good ideas or at least get credit for them. You know, Donna Haraway's landmark 1984 paper, which was published in a critical theory journal called Social Text, is making this argument. But Akeley and his Hall of African Mammals, although they feature in the paper, aren't the focus of the story she's telling, right? She's really focused on Teddy Roosevelt and his masculinity in this piece, Taxidermy in the Garden of Eden. So I want to spend a little bit more time on Akeley, very little bit of time, moving from taxidermy to conservation. Right? His first big breakthrough as a taxidermist was creating muskrats situated in their natural habitat. Those muskrats are still on display at the Milwaukee Public Museum. And what's groundbreaking about them for the history of display was that instead of just being old school taxidermy, like an animal kind of doing this in some weird pose all by itself, that he's put these animals in their natural context, and that they are coming into and or partially in and partially out of the water, their natural habitat. So you can see what they look like when their little feet are open. You can see their webbed feet, you can see their noses. They're kind of cute little creatures. Anyway, we're back to 1886. Akeley worked on the World Exposition in Chicago in 1893. In 1896, he had his first opportunity to go to Africa. Right, this was part of the Field Museum trying to catch up. They were in search of Somali wild asses. Something is deeply wrong with you as a hunter if you're searching for donkeys and you end up being attacked in the bush unexpectedly by a leopard, which you then claim to kill with your own bare hands. Yeah, I think it's an implausible story, but that is an actual picture of Akeley and the leopard he claims to have killed, and the wounds he clearly suffered in the process. Big part of creating his masculine identity, right? And this is, if you go to the websites of the AMNH or the Field Museum, this picture's there. They want to tell you this story about this founder. In 1905, this is when he took his wife with him. They went elephant hunting. Again, she proved to be the better shot. 1909, he was part of the Roosevelt expedition, which I'll talk about a little bit more. 1921 is when he went to the Congo and had a transformation. Right? In the Congo, hunting gorilla, he sees these gorilla as potentially connected to humans, as showing emotion. He starts to feel bad about all the animals he's killing and taxidermying. Doesn't stop him from killing gorilla and taking them back in taxidermy, but he feels bad for them. So he turns from being a pure hunter and collector to a conservationist. And he is credited in multiple published sources and repeated on the websites of both the Field Museum and the AMNH that he's the one mostly responsible for creating the first national park in Africa devoted to the preservation of an animal species, the mountain gorilla. So this park was established in 1925. It is the first national park in Africa. It was established in Belgian Congo. Does anybody know anything about Belgian colonialism? Yeah?
The partition of Africa, right?
Yeah, so Belgium was behind the partition of Africa. Was Belgium on the whole a very responsible colonial power? No. Did Belgium try and do anything for local people?
Well, they had indentured slaves working directly for the King of Belgium, and this resulted in a lot of, people losing limbs, slaves essentially being tortured, killed. So.
Yeah, no, it's not like colonization was good for anyone who was in part of it, but it was especially bad in the Belgian Congo, right? So that they're the first ones to do something marginally positive is a little surprising to me as an Africanist historian. But I'm also skeptical of this story that like they wouldn't have done something good if there wasn't some white guy from America as a savior to come help them do it. And I spent a couple of months in the summer digging through Belgian archives and coming up with a really different story. That's a different talk. But just to say, right, that the way in which museums tell stories suits the museum, doesn't necessarily suit the stories of how things got to be in the museum. Right, so there we get to the national park in 1925, and then 1926 when Akeley went back and actually died of fever on the mountain that he had come to love so much. So it's a very poetic story if we're looking for closure. But in this story, this timeline, this photograph, that photograph, where are the Africans? If we look really carefully, here, I'm going to bring us back, because that is the top of the photo. I did cut it off, right? We've got two African men with their heads out of the photograph. Probably they were gun bearers, men who went along as helpers. They get to show up in the picture. We don't know their names. And this is really typical of the way in which stories about scientific knowledge production in Africa unfold. Mostly the Africans that show up in those stories historically are relegated to stereotypes. In the writing from Akeley and his wife, we get repeated references to the often comical character of Bill. Right? They couldn't bother to learn his real name, so they just named their number one helper Bill. He served the Akeleys on 2 expeditions. He actually helped save Carl Akeley's life when he was attacked by elephants. But if they're not Bill, then they're the silent gun bearers, maybe those guys. They're the shiftless camp cooks who can't be convinced to do enough work on behalf of the expedition leaders who are there. They don't ever show up as named, well-rounded, and contributing individuals, which we know historically they actually would have been. So I'm in the process of trying to push back against this representation and recover actual rather than caricatured African voices, and most significantly to show how African knowledge was co-opted into what we think about as Western science. In the process, I'm also trying to ask the question, what does conservation look like, and from whose perspective? Right? So that takes us back to establishing this park. Who did it benefit? Who wanted it there? How did it come to be? As I said, Akeley is frequently cast as the savior of the mountain gorillas and the reason behind Africa's first national park, but I don't think he was. Shifting our attention a little bit, I want to think now about the 1909 Smithsonian expedition that Teddy Roosevelt was a part of. Right? And here, I think about this expedition as a carcass arms race. So what did this expedition look like? Right? It was high profile, led by a very immediately recent US president, got a lot of coverage in the US press, got coverage in the international press. They were gone for a month. They employed 500 porters, took 4 tons of salt, gathered 11,000, almost 11,400 specimens. Animals of all different sizes, right? With the intention to bring them all back to the US. They ended up not being able to ship all those animals, but they killed them all anyway. It took 8 years of cataloging for the museum to start to make sense of the enormity of the specimens that Roosevelt's expedition brought back. In terms of big game, right, we see that there were more or less 5,000 mammals in that collection. 3 leopards. Well, you guys can read the numbers. I don't need to read those to you. And I want to tell you a little bit about some of the animals in that list. White rhinoceros are currently near threatened as a species. In the world, there are only 2 northern white rhinos left. One of them an animal born in captivity in 1989, so she's nearing the end of her natural life. The southern white rhinoceros came back from fewer than 50 individuals in the early 1900s to about 18,000 today, but the population has declined in the last 2 years because of poaching, so we want to think about that. The black rhino is also critically endangered. Their numbers hover around 5,500 animals, and they're also currently being hard hit by poaching. Right? So what did it mean that we as a collective in the global north took some of those animals out of the African environment, and for what purpose? I know some of the animals were consumed as food, which, there we go. And this expedition was both celebrated and controversial in its day. And I'm going to read to you a quotation from someone who was observing at the time. With his left eye blind from a boxing injury suffered in the White House, Teddy Roosevelt violated basic sporting conventions. Many of the 512 animals that were killed by his son Kermit or himself were shot repeatedly at excessive ranges. He lost wounded animals. Sometimes he let other shooters finish the job. Roosevelt's Kenyan friend, Lord Cranworth, whose firm outfitted the safari, deplored the, and here this is Cranworth's words, slaughter with which Roosevelt and his party perpetrated. He asked, do these night and white rhino ever cause Roosevelt a pang of conscience or a sleepless night? And so it's not just a modern projection backwards. There were critics at the time. But then, as now, the goals of knowledge production justified this violent extraction of resources in an explicitly colonial context. Right, now I'm focused on animals today, but the process wasn't limited to Europeans and Americans acquiring just creatures and all the creatures they could get their hands off. They acquired a lot of other things, took it out of context, and put them on display as examples of Western knowledge. Now, to think about the consequences of that, I want to turn to pop culture. So, anybody remember seeing Black Panther? Yeah, I see some yeses, some nos. So this is the character Killmonger, right? And he's the film's villain, but he brings his own knowledge, right, to a gallery that's clearly intended to symbolize the British Museum.
How can I help you?
I was just checking out these artifacts. They tell me you're the expert.
You could say that.
They're beautiful. Where's this one from?
The Bobo Ashanti tribe, present-day Ghana, 19th century.
For real? And what about this one?
That one's from the Edo people of Benin, 16th century.
Now, tell me about this one.
Also from Benin, 7th century. Fula tribe, I believe.
Nah.
I beg your pardon.
It was taken by British soldiers in Benin, but it's from Wakanda, and it's made out of vibranium. Don't trip. I'm gonna take it off your hands for you.
These items aren't for sale.
How do you think your ancestors got these? You think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?
So I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
You got all this security in here watching me ever since I walked in, but you ain't checking for what you put in your body.
Right? That upends assumptions about knowledge production. Right? In the way that this scene is set up, who is supposed to be the resident expert? Where's the knowledge supposed to live?
The museum's curator as the expert.
The museum's curator is the expert, right? But here we have a guy with, you know, a tattered jeans jacket and some dreads and a confrontational attitude. Is that where formal knowledge resides? Right? Not in the knowledge production that privileges museums and universities. Right? But it turns out, right, this is fiction, right? But it turns out he's the one who actually knows.
I'd like to follow that up. So the other character is not basically the expert, but he's the result or the living history of his culture.
The living history of his culture. Yep. And he is an expert, right? But his expertise isn't always valued or acknowledged within formal Western structures, right? And so that's something that I want to push at right now. I'm going to skip this slide about the significance of South Africa. You're just going to have to trust me. It was a really cool and interesting place in the 18th century. It still is. But there were lots of plants and animals that Europeans had no idea about. It was an easy place to get to. It was a settler colony, so they had places to stay and they could move around. So a lot of early scientific knowledge was happening in Southern Africa. This guy, Robert Jacob Gordon, ended up being a commander of the Dutch East India Company garrison. So he was the #1 military man at the Cape of Good Hope, this Dutch colony. Here's all his interesting life story. What's really interesting to me was that as a military commander, he spent time on journeys to the interior, 6 months at a time, trekking around South Africa, trying to understand indigenous people and flora and fauna. Right, so he took these 4 trips after he was a military officer in South Africa. He published a lot. There's been a lot published on him about all of his many contributions to the history of science, right? And these end up with scintillating titles like Gordon's contribution to botany, Gordon's contribution to zoology, Gordon's contributions to astronomy. That was a bad mishap, astronomy. Right, so who counts in the history of science? He did all this research. People, he was in correspondence and conversation with learned men in Europe. He's a history of science dude, right? But how did he find what he found? Was he just walking around in the veld and was like, oh, here's a plant no one has seen before? Local informants. This local expertise that you were talking about, right? The repository of knowledge. Gordon is interesting to me because there were lots of other 18th century naturalists, because in his field notes, he talked about where he was getting his information, and he named the people he was in conversation with to a much greater degree than most of his colleagues or compatriots. So he helps me ask this question about who counts in the history of science, because he does more than most other people to acknowledge the sources of his information. And I want to finish with a story about a giraffe specimen. So the giraffe was a particularly curious animal to 18th century Europeans. They'd seen pictures, they'd seen a few specimens. They couldn't believe that it really existed, that it was really this big in proportion to human beings. They had all these questions. How big is its brain? How does blood get up to its head if it's standing up? So the only way to answer those, right, was to kill an animal, bring it back and study it in Europe. And Gordon was really intent on being the first person to deliver a great giraffe specimen back to Europe. Now, around sunset on October 12th, 1779, after 6 hours in the saddle, Gordon spotted a living giraffe for the first time. It was far enough away that he had to use his pocket telescope to make it out clearly. But members of his entourage, right, so this means Africans, were closer, driving the animal towards their patron and laying the groundwork to secure the expedition's first giraffe specimen. And here I'm going to quote from his field notes. It was coming towards us on his way to the river, he recorded in his log. Sometimes it stood still and moved its neck to one side and then the other, like the mast of a ship that was being prepared for top and tackle at sea. One of my Hottentots, this is his words, right, saying this is his possession, so one of his servants had already seen it, and stalking it, wounded it slightly, but it ran away. Just then, Pienaar, a local settler who was with him, arrived from hunting rhinos along that path. He went off after the animal, and setting my dogs after it as well, I heard them barking and then 2 shots. Although dusk was falling fast by this time, I walked, having left my horse behind, in the direction of the barking, and I reached Pienaar when it was completely dark, following the signal and shots in the making of a fire, an hour away from the wagons. I found this beautiful and remarkable animal, one of the loveliest that nature has formed, dead. Right? And this is clearly a kind of cartoonish, fanciful. I love these giant eyelashes. That partly it's Gordon's not the greatest artist, but he's really passionate about this animal. This is the most lyrical, most emotional passage in thousands of pages of field notes, which are mostly like, today it was 47 degrees. He dug this giraffe. He says, I could not satisfy my desire to view the creature enough, no matter how long I gazed at it by the light of the burning wood. So that's his first take on it, right? He's drawing its inside parts, sending drawings back to the Netherlands, to the stadtholder, the head of state, to distribute among the learned men of the Netherlands so they could understand this giraffe. Right? He does this other very weird drawing of the skeleton with a live head. But the story, right, he talks about a guy called Afrikander, his hunting aide, who wounded the giraffe in its foreleg, which was the first step towards actually being able to kill and then take the animal apart. The skeleton of this animal still exists in a museum collection in Europe. Not the Dutch collection where you'd expect it to be, But in the French Museum of Natural History, because when Napoleon went on his raiding and looting expeditions, right, this was part of what he took back to Paris, and that's Gordon's giraffe specimen, right, on exhibit in the Netherlands in 2017, when the French decided, after years of negotiating, that they would let the Dutch have this back for a few months, right? So, I mean, it seems silly that there'd be any kind of national dispute over a 250-year-old giraffe skeleton. But the political implications of this knowledge production are still with us. And if we have any doubt about who actually shot that giraffe, you can't see it in this picture, that's me. Looking all like scholarly in the museum, don't you think? But there at the bottom behind me on the foreleg of this giraffe is a little puttied space in the animal's foreleg filling in the bullet hole. So it confirms the story that Gordon told us. Why do I know so much about Gordon or Akeley, or any of their contemporaries? And I know so little about the Africans who actually helped make all of this knowledge creation and collection possible. The people who helped them navigate unfamiliar terrain, brokered arrangements with local people, hunted for their shared pot, back to the 260-some animals that Roosevelt's expedition needed, right? Most of those animals would have been shot by Africans to keep the community alive. Many of the details about African knowledge production are lost to us, but some of them are recoverable. And as scholars, we need to do more of that recovery. As consumers of knowledge, that's all of us in this room, we need to pay more attention to the voices that are unlike our own. Thanks, and I would love to take your questions.